I just found recently. And it's been really wonderful to hear all of your stories, and how deep they resonate with me is also surprising and not surprising. So I really appreciate what everyone has shared. My name is Selena, like I said, and I am a PhD student at Western University. So shout out to Dan, one of our first presenters, who's also here from Western today. My background is in nonprofit leadership and social change work in public librarianship. But the current work that brings me into my PhD actually has very little to do with my presentation today. It's really more about the experience of being a PhD student than my research itself. My pronouns are she, her, and one of the most impactful things about who I am, like so many of you being late diagnosed, but I was a micro preemie, meaning that I was born under 27 weeks of gestation, under 60% of your regular pregnancy time. I was born at 26 weeks, weighing just 1 pound, 12 ounces. And this is in the early 80s when this was quite a profound occurrence, was very unusual to happen. Being born as a micro preemie has had some really significant impacts on my life. I have a compromised immune system. I have a vision impairment, my very cranky lungs, and I have ADHD, which actually is 4 times more likely for micropreemies under 27 weeks of gestation. So despite the likelihood of me having ADHD, I still was only diagnosed in my late 30s. That happened when I returned to graduate school. And I thought, I really need graduate school to not be like my undergraduate experience. I need to not feel the panic and the anxiety and the stress that drove my undergraduate experience, feeling broken all the time that I was doing things incorrectly. And so that inspired me to then go get my diagnosis, which fits with all of my other medical profiles, but surprisingly still, as we've mentioned, due to the genderized nature of ADHD, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, it took some time for that to come about. I want to offer a content warning and an invitation for my presentation today. So as you can tell by the title of my work, the Grief Catalogue, I'll be talking about some pretty heavy topics: death and dying, loss, and grief. These can be exceptionally uncomfortable. They're exceptionally uncomfortable for me as the presenter. I don't think I have ever yet talked about this without becoming emotional myself. And so that is a very important aspect of that work, is also then the invitation to invite emotion and response. As particularly if you are navigating grief yourself, you know that hearing of others' grief can be really triggering. So I do want to head that, but I also want to invite you. Our project really works against the Western norm of overcoming grief and death. And Garcia said it best when they said, "We stake a claim, sit with it, and affirm grief as an ongoing process." So I invite all of you to do that today as well. I want to start by saying we know that colonialism does not spark joy. My background is I'm an Acadian settler. I grew up in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, but I am currently located in London, Ontario, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandan people. But as an Acadian person, my community has a deep sense of colonial oppression, but we also walk a very fine line now of having experienced oppression historically, and now our community perpetuating colonial oppression ourselves. So having been oppressed, now our community is often the oppressor. So reconciliation is something that is incredibly personal to me. I think deeply about relationship repairing and community reparations. And these are pieces that weave into a lot of the work that I do. I often think about my role in my community. I think about historic relations and how we can repair those on a really deep level. I want to start first by talking about my dad. And this is where I usually get pretty emotional. It's the hardest part of the presentation for me. When I started my MLIS, I was about 9 months into my graduate work when my dad very suddenly and very unexpectedly passed away. I am an only child, so my relationship with my parents is quite tight-knit and close. I was actually here on campus texting with my father when he passed very suddenly while I was at school, in the middle of our conversation and while I was here in my faculty. And my grief was immediate and profound. I thought that I knew what sadness was. I thought I knew what grief was like in the grief that I had experienced previous in my life. It was nothing like this. I immediately was physically impacted by the depth of my grief. I developed vertigo and lost my ability to walk in a straight line. I had to go to physical therapy to regain my ability to walk. I made the incredibly difficult decision to stay in school in that term. I chose not to take an academic leave. Part of the reason for that was because I needed something to keep me going. And part of it was because of the community that surrounded me while I was here. I needed, though, a lot of support in that time. I lost the ability to read. Words looked like they were completely jumbled. I couldn't make sense of anything I was reading anymore. Letters were mixed up. Words were nonsensical. I looked at a book and it was like I was reading a different language. I also completely couldn't output anything that I was thinking. I could think critically, but I couldn't communicate it. I couldn't think words out. It was like someone was in my mind, completely wiping the words like a blackboard out of my mind as I thought them. The amount of physical elements of grief that were present were so surprising and shocking to me. But as I continued through my MLIS, I also realized that the ways that I was feeling weren't unique to me. There were others who were feeling these deep-seated elements of grief, but I didn't know about them because we don't know about them. I felt very isolated in the way that I was experiencing grief, but I also started to see where those threads of grief throughout others in my community were coming through. So that had me because of my ADHD, I found I needed a different way to address my grief. I tried grief counseling. It was a terrible experience. I tried ignoring my grief. It was a terrible experience. And I really realized that I intellectualize the rest of my emotions. I really also need to then intellectualize my grief for me to process that. So this started a process of thinking through what this might look like in my progress. So when I then am looking at grief in academia, I started looking at what it looks like for others. There's a lot of research out there about grief in academia and for graduate students in particular. A lot of it, though, focuses on, similar to the workplace, how to manage it, how to address it, how to get services. It looks at grief as a moment, an event in time that needs to be overcome and supported. And it doesn't consider grief as a long-lasting transformation of the person who is experiencing grief. There was a study done that showed that 56% of graduate students within a 36-month period had experienced a substantial loss. Graduate studies is slightly different than undergraduate studies because we're at a different stage in our life. We're typically older. We have a higher rate of parental loss. We're just experiencing the challenges, the ups and downs of life at a different pace than you do in your undergraduate work. 56% of graduate students is substantial. Those were folks that had lost either a family member or a close friend or a parent. And so that is a high rate of loss when you really look at it. Yet, grief in academia is very hidden. It's buried because we have a lot of expectations about what it means to be an academic, but particularly what it means to be a grad student. We are expected to produce all the time. Our work is always urgent. When our experience in grad school is you feel like you can never take a break, even though you're there for 5 years, the work is always urgent. There's always something to do, but you are not. We're expected to create a comfortable work environment and soften the elements of our grief for those around us, but we're comforting it for them and not for ourselves. And we're expected to be professionals. We're new in our fields. We're really trying to find our place as new professionals, and we feel a lot of expectations. We're definitely confronting that imposter syndrome. So we have to be professional, which is, be yourself, but be better. And so there are these elements in academia that come up against what grief demands of you. And coincidentally, or not, these elements are also recognized by the Center for Community Organizing as tenets of white supremacy in organizations. So we can see similar threads of productivity and urgency also push through this idea of oppressive learning. This quote that has been one of the most profound for me in terms of when we subdue emotion in grad school, we create these sagas around those who do feel the effects of grief and who do share it openly. And it says we are too much, and our grief gets in the way of our work, which is always posed as separate from feeling. Those sagas then create cultures of willful unfeeling. So we are willfully creating a culture that is sterilized and willfully blind to the suffering of the community that we are sharing together. And then I came up against grief and ADHD. And so what I found is that, of course, everyone struggles with grief. Grief is a uniting experience. It's difficult for everyone that experiences it. But a little like everywhere, all at once, all the time, I felt grief in all ways consistently. I found that my grief amplified my ADHD symptoms, and my ADHD symptoms amplified my grief. I felt like I was in this cycle. And I felt this most when the most common piece of advice I was given was that time will heal your grief. Time will heal. You'll feel better with time. And actually, for me, time exacerbated my grief. My grief deepened as time went on. I was worse 3 months on, 6 months on, 9 months on than I was in the beginning. And part of that is that the initial shock wears off and you tend to set into this existential, now long-term missing of someone. But part of it is also the time blindness that comes with ADHD, that you feel things all the time. Time is not felt in the same linear sense. I spoke about my inability to focus. My emotions became incredibly unpredictable. I experienced great social discomfort. In that moment, I inadvertently cut off most of my social relationships. I only had the spoons for what was immediately in front of me. So most of my casual acquaintances were the first to be shrugged off, not on purpose, not because I didn't care for them, but because of the capacity that I had was so limited. And my forgetfulness was at an all-time high. I have inattentive type ADHD, and let me tell you that for the first year, I think I've lost everything that I owned. I also have a small child. I think I lost everything that she owned. It was definitely the most forgetful period of my life. I could not find focus at all. And then the third component of this that I came up against was this idea of doctoral becoming. And if you haven't heard of this, it's this idea that your doctoral work, your work in your PhD, isn't just about knowledge creation. It isn't just about creating new information or synthesizing information. It's also transformative as a person, that we are asked to think about the element of truth. Where does truth come from? What does knowledge mean? Where do we think that these things stand, and how does that account for in our research? These are deep questions that are asked of us. And that is incredibly difficult work to do when your whole life has been thrown upside down. It's very difficult to make sense of what you think truth is grounded in when you no longer have sense of the way your own world is shaped. And that led to this, the Grief Catalogue. This project actually came to me in a dream when my father first passed, but it needed to sit with me. It needed the right time and the right people and the right amount of vulnerability that I just wasn't ready for in the first time of his passing. So this project came about when I realized there were others like me in my faculty of library and information science here at Western. There were others that were suffering and grieving as well. And so we are a collective of doctoral students that are neurodivergent and disabled. And we found that our grief was different than those around us. We experienced all of those amplification of symptoms. It was confusing because the typical advice about grief just didn't seem to apply to us. We seem to sometimes feel the opposite. And so we created this time together where we would journal together, more like ramblings. We would share those deep, very personal journals together. We would check in with one another. We talked a lot about what it was like to be in graduate school, particularly to be in library school. As has been mentioned before, we're very concerned with orderly and structure and organization. And when your whole life feels disordered and unstructured and chaotic, it can be very difficult to hold those concepts in other ways and apply those. And so we found this really unique experience of being in library school while grieving, this idea that we're expected to create order, expected to understand these structural systems, but everything feels so unstructured that it can be difficult to think through those things. We met with each other for a period of time. We weren't sure where this was going to go. It started by just kind of collaborating together and building a really strong relationship amongst ourselves. And then there was an opportunity to bring something forward. And we saw three themes that came up amongst all of us. We saw that our grief was hit by time and space. So similar to that time blindness, our grief wasn't improving over time. We were experiencing a different type of time relationship to grief. We experienced challenges with understanding private and public expressions of grief, when it was, say, quote, appropriate to grieve and when it wasn't. And we also struggled with this idea of visible and invisible grief, what was outward showing and what was inward showing and buried underneath, and what permissions we had or didn't have to make that invisible grief visible. And so myself and two of the collaborators, Hillary Anderson and Z. Coltman, we created an exhibit of our grief. We each curated a small mini exhibit, a small mini catalog of our individual grief experiences, as well as an interactive invitation for others in our community at this conference to think and participate and explore their own vulnerability as well. So these are the two pieces that I put forward in my curation. The one on the left is my PhD application, handwritten on a chalkboard many, many, many times, written and erased, written and erased, written and erased. And that was what the process was like for me applying for my PhD. It was the first new milestone that I met after my father's passing. And it was probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And so you can see in my piece that in the rewriting and the erasing and the rewriting, because that's what it felt like was happening in my mind, it's very hard to put to words your passion when you're in the middle of grief. So I wrote here my application on the chalkboard, and then you can see the water streaks, which represent the many tears that went into producing my PhD application. On the right is an overlay and underlay of aspects of my identity combined with the theoretical underpinnings of my research. So I use the fractals of Octavia Butler and Adrienne Marie Brown, this idea that the small can be replicated in the large. And then behind, which is also seen in the fern, which represents the work of eco-theorist Joanna Macy. And then behind that is my father's obituary, which I wrote and which represents not only his life, but my life as well. And so to me, this shows that all of these aspects are all of who I am in my PhD work. My research is ingrained in my grief, and my father's life and my life underlays all of that work, and all of it works together. So we made an invitation in our exhibit. We said, here we have made our invisible grief visible. We share with vulnerability and humility in an invitation for you to do the same. We were set up in the library at our conference kind of right after the lunch period as an open-ended period for all the creative works that were there. And I have to be honest, I expected an empty room. I thought everyone's eating lunch, they're enjoying, they're gonna go take a walk. They're probably not gonna choose on their own time to come up to the library and see our exhibit. I was running a few minutes late, ADHD, and I came upstairs and I expected an empty library, and I actually came to an exhibit full of at least 30 people. And I was shocked. I actually had to walk out and walk back in because it was so different than what I expected. What I saw was my community, our library and media community here and my faculty, engaging deeply with our work. People were crying, people were sharing stories, hugging each other. And what we saw is that people didn't just move through our exhibit and then move on to the next thing. They stayed for the entire hour that we were there. They stayed beyond their own exposure to it. They stayed there to support others that experienced our exhibit. They stayed there to share stories. And the level of engagement was incredibly shocking. I was not prepared for that. And when I think back, it surprises me because we knew we were sharing vulnerably of our own grief, but we were not prepared for others to equally share as vulnerably as we were. And so this was one of the greatest learnings that we had from our exhibit. Our invitation for participation was that we talked about invisible and visible grief and had a station set up that gave some prompt questions about visible grief, like how does grief spill out of you? In which ways do others see that you're grieving? And we asked them to write them on cue cards. So this is at the beginning of when our exhibit went up. And we received some comments like, it's a lot, but we're here, right? Or all my relationships suffer, small talk is meaningless. These were elements of being able to put those together, the things that we're able to share. But then we also asked folks to share their invisible grief. We had a collection of invisible ink pens, which they then wrote their invisible grief on and pinned, and folks were able to explore what others had written by using blacklight flashlights. And so our display had both visible grief on with markers and invisible grief that was then explored using black light as people felt able to engage with the content. This all had a profound impact on us, the collective. We found it incredibly healing through creation and through the co-creation with others in our faculty. It was deeply validating that the ways that we grieve, our neurodivergent ways of grief, resonated with others and were valid. We built relationships with people we had never met before, or maybe had passed in the halls, but had never really connected with. We swapped stories of grief. We shared vulnerabilities together. It was also a relief. We held this grief as a collective for a long time throughout this work, and this felt like a spilling over, that we no longer had to hold it just between ourselves, but we were able to share that with our community. And then there was an impact on us, the collective of our faculty. It revealed a buried desire for vulnerability. It was very clear that people's grief and emotions were just at the surface with how easily they were spilling out in our exhibit. There is a need there for other opportunities to connect. It's deepened our community building. It fundamentally shifted the feeling of the conference for the rest of the day. There was a different sense of community and relationship at the student conference that I think, to be honest, wouldn't have been there had this experience not happened collectively. And I hope that we're making space in our faculty for a different kind of academia. One of the senior leaders in our faculty, I walked through our exhibit and they became quite moved. We did it just the two of us. And they said, you know, I never thought that I couldn't not compartmentalize. I thought that that was what I had to do. I've never considered that I could grieve differently than separating it from my scholarly self to myself. So I'm hoping that we've sparked those conversations. We know that our project is just the beginning. This isn't the end. We're still all grieving. We're still all working together. We don't really know what comes next, but we have collected other students who have also felt that experience as well. And we look forward to whatever expression of our work comes next. Thank you, everyone. If you would like to reach out with me or talk with me more about our project, my information is there. And my resources are here at the end, which I'll have up with the slides later. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that. Yeah, for that.